It's funny. My senior year in high school, I kind of had this feeling that I wanted to be a principal. I
Mm,
got into a lot of trouble, so everybody that like looks at me now as an assistant principal, they're like that knew me back when I was in school. They're like, man, like you out of all people, how in the
right.
world, you were a hothead. You did this. You got in trouble. Blah blah blah. And I was like, yeah, that's kind of what I feel like what makes me a better educator.
Thank you for tuning in to sip on this with a Paris. About to get lit with these topics. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for the love and your time. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Without further ado, I bring to you this for you to sip on too.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back for another episode of Sip on This with Adam Paris. As you see, we have a fresh face on today's episode. This is my nephew, Tyler Mavity, aka Mavo, for the ones that really know. But disclaimer before we jump into today's episode, pardon me if I sound congested, raspy, if I start coughing, all that nonsense, because I technically do have COVID. Yeah, your boy's been in quarantine for about, I think today makes day 7. I've been in quarantine. I think my quarantine ends on Wednesday. So I've been in quarantine for 7 days. So luckily, no serious symptoms at this point. I got the bad stuff out the way within the first 2 days I was there. And then, side note, also for those that know me well enough by now, my dog is also in the background. He's playing with his bone right now. So if you hear any click clacking, that's him in the back. But anyway, Tyler, my good principal.
Hey man, first and foremost, Adam, I just want to, thank you for having me on your show. You're right. I have watched several episodes, and you have definitely been entertaining, doing your thing. A
I
major
try.
shout out, major shout out with that, man. Really
Appreciate it.
sorry about
Appreciate it.
this whole COVID thing. Like it's a nightmare, bro. Like I don't even
Nightmare.
know, like, are we ever gonna
Nightmare.
wake up from this, man? But I'm glad you're doing good, and you're not hospitalized or anything like that. So,
Right.
but yeah, man. So just stay safe, stay healthy.
Yeah.
But woo, it's crazy because I'm an educator.
Right.
Right now, my role, I guess I'll speak to a little bit of my role, how I've gotten to this point. So this would be year 7. Yeah, so year 7, 2015 to 2022. So yeah, about to go into year 7, or 7 or 8 here. And so um, started off as a high school teacher, did a little bit of work as a head basketball coach. For those of you know Millbrook, shout out to Millbrook High School. But so I did a little bit of work with that, and then I transitioned from Millbrook, went to Charlotte, did some work out there in the Charlotte Mecklenburg school system, where I was a an AP teacher. I taught psychology, but I first started out teaching a little bit of like the social studies umbrella, like history, sociology, psychology, all of the government. And
Mhm.
so within that, got out to Charlotte. I transitioned to an instructional academic facilitator, did a little bit of work as dean of students. And within those roles, I led, ACT, SAT prep, did a lot of professional development, um, a lot of training, instructional training. And so once I left my work in Charlotte Mecklenburg schools, uh, I just got a position about 6, 7 months ago as an assistant principal. I'm in middle school right now, so it's
Mhm.
crazy. Middle school is a wild ball game, man.
I bet.
But yeah, it's definitely one of my professors always says, yeah, I did some time in the middle school, so it's kind of like jail. I
Oh,
did my
dang.
time, but no. So I mean, yeah, so that's why a little bit of my background now. I really enjoy being an assistant principal for the middle school, and just getting gaining experience, and
Mhm.
I think eventually my goal is to move out and probably be a principal, probably a superintendent.
Mhm.
So that's a little bit about, my history.
Well, first off, let's take this back a little bit
Hmm.
because I never knew at what point did you decide like to become an educator. Like I don't ever think we ever had that conversation.
Yeah, man, that's a good question. Actually, I've gotten that question here a lot, pretty recently. And I think it all goes back to, being in organized sports growing up.
Mhm,
Definitely, playing travel ball um, at a high level all across the country. And I
mhm,
think just learning some of the traits of like teamwork and discipline and
mhm,
you know really just translating that competitive spirit, that competitive drive with sports and instilling that in our youth, right? So
mhm.
just trying to unleash their talent. Everybody has a unique. They're all unique. Everybody is different, and success is measured differently by every person.
Right.
But it really just kind of fell on me. I think, it's funny. My senior year in high school, I kind of had this feeling that I wanted to be a principal. I
Mhm.
got into a lot of trouble. So everybody that like looks at me now as an assistant principal, they're like that knew me back when I was in school. They're like, man, like you out of all people, how in the
Right.
world, you were a hothead. You did this. You got in trouble. Blah blah blah. And I was like, yeah, that's kind of what I feel like what makes me a better educator is because I've
Mhm.
kind of been there, done that. I've gotten in
Right.
trouble, so it's kind of helping them, not make the same mistakes. But
Right.
I think it all started, bro, as pretty much 12th grade. Just kind of knew I wanted to be a principal, and then I had to go into obviously teaching and do that, and, pay my dues and move
Mhm.
up the ladder, basically.
Yeah. That's
Yep.
so funny that you say that because just like everybody else, I was on the same page. I'm like, Tyler, you want to do what?
Hmm.
Like, are you serious?
Yeah, man.
But
And it's not, it's not a lot of money. Obviously, people know that, but it's an
mm,
extremely rewarding role. And even at the middle, I can see how the impact and how impressionable these kids are. I mean,
mhm,
they really do believe they believe you. And, if you really use that power in a positive way, you can inspire some really good kids. So I don't know. I love it every day.
so something that you actually mentioned, I kind of want to touch on a little bit. So I know that one of the many issues with education here in North Carolina is the fact that for some reason we do not pay our teachers.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, you being an educator yourself, would you happen to know as to why that is? That we're last in education, I'm assuming for, more than just the pay aspect, but I was wondering if you would be able to touch on that a bit, if at all.
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked because I'm also getting my doctorate in educational leadership right now. I just finished my first semester. I actually have two classes beyond that, so semester and a half, sort of. And a part of my work, as far as the building blocks of my dissertation, is looking at um, kind of recruitment and retention
Mhm,
of teachers, as
mhm,
specifically as teachers of color.
mhm,
But within that research, there is the question when it comes to recruitment and retention, and it revolves around salary, it revolves around pay,
mhm,
in North Carolina specifically. And so, the answer to your question, well, there's a lot of variables within that, but there and you look at it, we got, education kind of funnels. It's a government agency, right? So it funnels the
mhm,
money funnels from the federal, the state, the local level. And one of the answers that's really pressing is that our we have a lot of programs that exist to help with recruitment and retention, but we don't really utilize them as best as we should. And
mhm,
so when we look at other states, for example, and the way that they use programs to recruit and retain teachers, and the way that they structure their funds,
mhm,
essentially, is really different than the way that we do it here. But I think the bottom line is in our North Carolina Constitution, a lot of people don't know this, but there's a clause in our Constitution in North Carolina that states that the schools must be funded adequately. Um,
Mhm.
and so when you look at adequately versus equitably,
Mhm.
it right there kind of states that that's really why if we're looking at adequately, you only need but X amount of money to perform adequately. All right.
Mhm.
And so when you look at bigger districts like Charlotte, Mecklenburg, compared to a smaller district, such as I don't know, let's do Wayne County. I mean, it's just the as long as it's adequate to fit that particular district within that particular infrastructure of
Mhm.
of the way that kind of it fits and works in that county, then that's all you need. But that's not necessarily equitable,
Mhm.
And so it's a lot of stuff surrounding and if you want you guys that are listening to get a little bit more information on that, look at the Leandro case, North Carolina versus Leandro.
Mhm.
And it really does talk a little bit about funding and not only salaries with teachers, but also funding of schools.
Mhm.
So yeah.
I honestly never really realized how like salary wise teachers didn't really get paid that great until so when I was working at my first farmer job, uh one of my team members had just moved up from Atlanta, and she clearly was an educator, and she moved up, and just like she had got added to my team. I was training her or whatever, and I was like, like, so where are you coming from? And it threw me off when she said, oh, I was a teacher down in Georgia, and I was like, and now you're doing pharma. I'm like, where did
Hmm.
that come from? It's not every day that you work with a teacher. And so I was like, what made you come back to pharma opposed to staying, as an educator? And she was like, you guys don't pay anything here. She was like, in Atlanta, she said, like, I got paid pretty decent, and granted, her husband was in the military, so she said, like, of course they did pretty decent living down in Atlanta, but when he was stationed up here, she was just like, naturally, she was like, oh, I'm gonna just obviously continue being the teacher. And she was like, the math wasn't mathing when it came to the money. She was like, no, I don't like this. She was like, I couldn't believe that it was kind of like a slap in the face because of her years of service as as an educator. And she
Yeah.
was like, I felt like they was hitting me with entry level pay by the time I got here, and I didn't appreciate that. And what else I learned is, so ironically, my very first trainer at my job, his name was Tyler too. And he actually, more ironic, he also taught at Millbrook.
Okay.
So
Okay.
like he was like, yeah, man. He said, I actually taught at Millbrook for about a year as a biology teacher. And he was like, and I loved it. He said, I love my students. He said, I never had like any bad experiences the whole time I was at Millbrook. He said, like, of course, the schedule is great. He was like, but it just sucked when it came to the pay. He said, that's literally the only reason why I left was the pay. He said, because like, like having all the breaks and stuff like that. He was like it's your ideal position. It just sucks that they don't, you know, pay you as much as what you feel like you should earn, because I think a lot of people don't really give educators the respect they deserve either.
Yeah.
It takes on a lot to take on. First off, kids these days, man, I'm sure you can attest to this too. They're just wired different.
They
So
are.
I can only imagine the things that educators go through with their students these days, but that can be a conversation for another day.
Oh yeah. I mean, that is a definitely something that is, you know, you hit on a lot of good points, man, and I know pay is extremely important, especially when you think about the hoops and all of the requirements that you need to become an educator, right? You go to
Mhm.
school, you got to get a degree, you got to pass the licensure exam, you got to maintain a certain grade point average, right? You got to do whether you're in if you're in a traditional, you got to do student teaching and do all that. And then if you do the alternative pathway, you still have to, you can be an educator or a teacher, but you still have to take these method courses at the same time,
Mhm.
pay this X amount of money, and it's like, man, people that go through college that didn't get a scholarship or academic or sports scholarship, and they pay, whether they took out loans, I mean, they're still paying. The idea is when you graduate from college, you know, that you get a job and you can start making enough money to support not only paying for bills, but also paying your school loans back, right?
Mhm.
You can't do both as a teacher. You just really can't. And so that's big. But there's a lot of other ways in which, and I always tell like I can't control money. There's
Right.
nothing I can do to help with that. That's one thing that's out of my hands. But what I can do, at least in my sphere of influence, is um, create a culture that respects educators,
Mhm.
that they are valued, that they are extremely important, and then also not only respecting them in the building, but also getting the outside community, such as parents and other supporters and partners, to to value them whenever we have like a teacher work day. Make sure that we can get some business partnerships, and they can come in and feed them for free. Just
Mhm.
different things, little stuff that we can do, or our parent teacher organization, they can help and give a little bit of extra during the holidays, or they can
Mhm.
provide just different things to make their job easier. Because that, as an administrator, the one thing, one of the most important aspects of my position is to make um, my teachers, to make their job easier.
Right.
That's literally the main objective of my job as a principal or an assistant principal, is to make their work as easy as possible. Because, like you said, it is extremely difficult to be a teacher.
Mhm. I was about to ask, like, uh, I'm gonna try to choose my words carefully here.
Yep.
What are some? I would okay. I'm gonna ask this.
Sure.
So, from an educator standpoint, what do you think are some of the like benefits or perks of being an educator? You feel like,
Definitely making connections, man, with the kids. That's just extremely rewarding. Making connections uh, with them, so they feel comfortable. Making connections with the parents about building that partnership. Um, it one of the, I guess, the perks is extremely rewarding. I mean, back to that question again, if you're in education and you're looking for that monetary kind of
mm,
reward, it's just you're in the wrong profession. Now,
mm,
they're never going to pay you enough to get rich, but they will pay you enough where you can still live, I feel like, a modest lifestyle. Like, you don't,
mm,
and if people want to live that lifestyle where it's lavish, where they want to, that's not, this is not the industry, right?
yeah,
And I always say that teaching is a lifestyle, it's not a job. it's
right,
it, it's not a job, it's a lifestyle. And so um eventually, yeah, I mean, if you move up and you want to be an administrator, if you want to move into superintendency, I mean, for example, like Charlotte Mecklenburg superintendent, I mean, I know he makes anywhere between 250 to $200,000 a year. I mean, I think that's quite a bit of money.
yeah,
But but at the same time, I mean, if you take away the kind of that monetary reward, um, it really is. You get your
mm,
summers off, and so that's a good, all of June and July where you still get paid, and just like you would if you're working, and you get to do whatever you want, right? For example, right now, even as an assistant principal or an educator, right, we got out on the 20th of December, and we don't go back to work until January 5th. So
mm,
we're still getting paid, right? And so
mm,
those are some extreme perks. As far as that's concerned, we get major holidays, those types of things, and of course the
mm,
weekends. But um, I always tell people it's really tough when you are a teacher and educator. It's like working, seriously, it's like working 2 to 3 months when everybody works, I feel like 1 month.
mm,
You're not an educator, right? And
mm.
so, um, let me think. Yeah, man. I mean, those are some of the perks I can just kind of at first thought think of.
I was about to say, but on the flip side of that, aside from pay, what would
Mhm.
be, if anything, some negative things that may deter people away from being an educator?
Yeah, man. So let me think. You know, that's an interesting question. And it's changed. Like right now, I think that education across the country, but especially more in states where, like you said, the educator, the teacher are not as respected by
Mhm,
the society,
mhm,
because respect does, I think, differentiate across the country and depending on
mhm,
what state you are in. But North Carolina in particular is in a very education is in a very vulnerable state right now.
mhm.
Not only are we reacclimating um, children and adults really, but and
Mhm.
parents, but we're reacclimating them and readapting them to school,
Yeah.
because not being in school for the 15 months, whatever, some of them to 18 months, not having that structured, every day, and kids and people in general, but especially kids, they earn for structure.
Mhm.
It's very important that they have that. And so when they didn't, I think that when you become an educator, you have to understand that you are partnering and you are teaching, and really helping raise young minds and people's children. And so
Right.
you have to adapt as an educator that every kid is unique. They come from different families. They all have different challenges within their family units, but at the same
Mm.
time, you have to manage those behaviors. You have to manage those personalities. And for some people, that is a really hard thing to do.
Mhm.
And so, you know, you could be, as an educator, you could be super sound in instruction and curriculum, and knowing how the mind works and how it learns. But then you also have that managing of behaviors and
Mhm.
personalities. And so that right there, I think that I always make a joke to some of my staff of saying, like, some parents are extremely vocal versus being engaged.
Yeah.
So, and we don't want the vocal parents, we want the engaged parents, right?
Right.
And I
I
think,
was
yeah,
I was, not to cut you off, but like it's something that you touched on is something that I definitely want to dive into, and that's just regarding how different it is now being an educator. I spoke about having COVID at the start of this conversation. I was just curious, how is it as an educator trying to teach at a time like this where, I remember when everything first went virtual, there was all this discussion about, okay, well, how are kids going to continue their schooling with everything going on? So, could you talk about what that kind of like transition was like, trying to transition into virtual learning opposed to in person, like face to face in class?
yeah, man, that's a very good point that you make, and it completely turned, um, it really completely turned education upside down,
I bet.
across the board. It was new territory, something that we had never tried to manage and lead through and teach through. And so, yeah, once COVID definitely hit and, we all went virtual, I mean, we had everything from, and I was, at this time, I was a dean of students, um, in a high school, and we
Ooh.
had students that just, we had to mobilize with different business partners to try to get hotspots, to get computers to every student,
Mhm.
to get, this is where Zoom and Microsoft Teams became extremely big, and partnering with those businesses to try to make sure we had those resources.
Mhm.
And so it was extremely, I remember when we first shut down, and within a matter of weeks, I started volunteering at a local center in Charlotte, in the kind of in the city, to put food packages together for kids, because you have to think a lot of our children rely on um, lunch from school.
Right.
you know, and they usually, I mean, some don't get a meal other than that. And so I
Mm,
remember, you know, doing some work for a couple of weeks where, you know, we would just ride around, man, and just, you know, drop off these breakfasts and lunches and stuff like that.
mhm,
It was tough, man. We really had to come together. But like you said, we did the best we could. I mean, some students we could not even locate. I mean, some students, and like I said, back to that family dynamic. Some students, man, we could not. I remember we were making phone calls, looking for kids, trying to figure out where they were because they weren't logging in on the computer, and obviously they weren't coming into school, so we didn't know,
mhm,
you know. And what's really crazy is that our funding, right, is big on what they call our average daily membership. It's called ADM, where our funding is based on our role or our attendance as students.
mhm.
And so we are expected to have. Man,
Minor glitch, minor glitch. Sorry about that, guys, but we're back. You were speaking about the different nuances that were different, that you guys were having to go through, you know, going virtual opposed to in-person learning. And you were talking about dropping off the care packages to the students that, you know, for like breakfast and lunch or whatever. And just to touch on that from my standpoint, just a little bit, I guess due to the fact that I don't have kids yet, I feel like I was kind of oblivious to the fact that so many kids rely on school to simply get fed. And when I heard that it was a lot of teachers out there doing volunteer work, such as yourself, that was dropping off packages and stuff like that, I was like, what? Like I said, it blew my mind because I was just so oblivious to it. And then you touched on the fact that also it was at that period in time, it was just hard to locate kids too. Um, uh, and I guess something that I wanted to kind of touch on too is the fact that out of curiosity, I was just wondering because for myself, I remember not having like I didn't have a computer in our home for some years or whatever until like I feel like the majority of people I knew didn't really start having computers in their home until it was getting close time to like middle school, I guess you can say. And
Yeah,
I was just curious as to, you know, I can only imagine the number of people out there that were affected by the virtual learning that didn't have the means to continue schooling virtually. So I'm assuming, I think you touched on this in your package that you just spoke to a little bit, but I'm assuming, was it the school's responsibility to try to get those students impacted by those circumstances, like the laptops and stuff that we would tend to lend out from time to time in schools, or how was that? How did the school step in to resolve some of those issues?
yeah, no, absolutely, yeah. So I mean, it was exactly the school's responsibility to help mobilize quickly and get those resources um, out to students. You know, if the expectation was them to log in and attend class. And this isn't like online learning. A lot of people are like, oh, they're just online learning. Like that's something that we did when we were in college, where you know, we had an online class. It's not the same. That's different, where you do an online class. But this was, you know, as they were going to, as if they were going to school for the 7 hours a day, where they were logging in, doing a class, and then getting, you know, 5 minutes and then transition to the next class and the next class and the next class. And they were just doing it virtually. And so
Mhm,
you had to think like that's not typically what an online class would be like, right?
mhm,
And so if you're talking about trying to get a 14, 15, 16-year old, and I'm just talking high school, and
mhm.
we would think high schoolers would be probably the most, at least at that skill, being a little bit probably uh, better off.
Yeah,
Nope, not at all, because
yeah,
they still didn't have the discipline, and let's just be honest, um, for a lot of students, you know, school is a place to get away from some of the tough and challenging kind of issues that they have at home,
right.
and so a lot of the students were trying to go to school and do virtual, you know, synchronous learning while they have, you know, different things going on in the background. And there was this whole, I remember this, there was this whole issue around, are we require them to turn their screens on? Where the kid is exposing their world, their home life into every other, and you know how kids are anyway, right? I mean, they're mean. They can be mean at least,
Yeah.
to a degree. And so exposing, certain kids' home life and the conditions in which they live in was really tough, And so I remember we were going back and forth as a district, and we were like, no, we can't force them to turn on their camera. But at the same time, how do you hold kids accountable? How do you know that they're actually learning? And it was just a nightmare, man. But we did the best that we could.
Yeah.
We got computers all out the kids very quickly. We got hotspots and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, it's all the way. It kind of the question always goes back to that support group at home. Are the kids being supervised? Do they have that support group? Do they have one parent? Do they have two parents? Are both parents working, two jobs to try to support? How many siblings are in that? I mean, the questions just go on and on and on. And so, one size doesn't fit all. And we as educators understand that, but we also know that the best way to communicate, the best way to learn, regardless, no matter what, is in person. And it always will be in person. I don't care how much technology advances as we move forward in our world. There's nothing that can be, as far as teaching and learning, when your brains are very malleable at that young age, that in person is just the best way to do it.
Yeah, I remember when everything went virtual, I was thinking back to my college days, right? And you spoke to us in college having the online classes or whatever. And I was a person I never did online courses because I was the person that I needed to be there physically
Right.
because it just hits different. Like, your learning styles, everyone's, like you said, everyone's learning style is just different. So for
Yeah.
me, trying to put myself back in like a high school setting, I'm like, there's no way. I For me, I felt like it couldn't have been as effective virtually as it was in person, and I also was me and my parents, were talking because my sister, when everything went virtual, she was a junior,
Yeah.
and she spent the last like year and a half of her high school career or whatever doing virtual learning, and now turn around going to college. And we were all curious, like, okay, I wonder how she's going to be able to adapt, doing high school virtually, to now being required to go back to doing like the in-person class to class sort of learning in college. And I mean, it seems like she's adjusted fine thus far, but at the same time, like, I can still tell that even colleges are still trying to, like, get their structure back together as well. Because I know some of her classes still aren't like how our typical classes were. Because, like, they still, when they can, try to cut down on the teacher, like the in person
Yeah.
lectures or whatever. Because although it's weird, because although she has like her still like her lecture courses,
Mhm.
classes like their labs are still all virtual. And
Yeah.
so I was kind of like, okay, so you're gonna have the lectures that are the larger classes still be in person, but the smaller, more intimate courses such as labs be virtual. And me having a science background, I'm kind of like, how can you do a lab virtual? Like, I just have so many, questions from the outside looking in. But I mean, it seems like they got it figured out for the most part, and the students are adjusted at this point in time. But it's still a crazy time to be alive, honestly.
Yeah, you were just talking about like, colleges, and how they're having to kind of reacclimate staff and students back from the virtual setting as well,
Mhm.
and having larger classes still being person, but the smaller lab classes being virtual.
Mhm.
And you were making a point about as a science background, what were you saying in regards to that?
Oh yeah, I was saying from a science background, I couldn't imagine what it's like to have labs done virtually opposed to in person.
Right.
Because of the types of experiments that you would have to do hands-on in a lab setting. So I was just, curious as to what, because I ask my sister all the time, I'm like, so dude, like, how are your classes these days? Like, do you feel like you're actually learning? Like, and it also sucks because aside from like the class standpoint, right? It's like, guys, like when me and a lot of our other friends get up and we talk about our younger siblings that are all in college right now, we're like, amongst each other, we're like, gosh, I don't think they're really having that same college experience, that
Right.
we had when we were in school, which kind of sucks. But at the same time, I feel like they're so adjusted to it because they didn't have the typical
Yeah.
high
I mean,
school years that we had.
there's definitely a convenience piece to that, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
not only for the student end, but the professor or the teacher end, right? And
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of things that can be done from for conveniency. But I mean, you can have, I mean, and this is just in my opinion, you can have, a plethora of um, instructional online digital resources, programs, whatever you want to call it. I mean, they have stuff nowadays where you can literally simulate virtually labs and different things that you would do.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, all of that stuff still can't replace the fundamental teacher or the
Yeah.
professor itself. I mean, just the knowledge and the ability to have that in person. And like you said, some students do well with the virtual setting, and that's why school choice is bigger than ever right now. You can do
Mm-hmm.
online academy, online school. You can even, and I'm speaking more to the high school,
Mm-hmm.
but you can do that now than you could before. And some students with that support, but they learn that way. They can learn that way. And so we had students that did very well all virtually, and we had students that didn't do well at all. And we had students that were do well in person. Once they got virtual, they did horrible, and
Mm-hmm.
vice versa. And I just think that that's why school choice um, is so big now. But at the end of the day, you still learn best, even though you might do well virtually, all virtual classes, you still learn best in person.
Yeah.
I'm gonna stay true to that always.
Yeah, I agree with that too. Like I said, like I myself, I couldn't imagine trying to do that stuff virtually opposed to in person. But something else that I don't know if we necessarily touched on yet is one or two things actually. I know we're coming up kind of close on our time, but I hope we can squeeze these two discussions in real quick.
Right.
But one was it- I know you've bounced around quite a bit in regards to like the different schools or whatever that you worked in or whatever. But I was just wondering, as far as your time, being an educator when COVID impacted, I guess, your employment or whatever, I was just wondering, did you, so like, did you ever work, I guess, at a school where COVID kind of like ran rampant and like, it just spread to a point where like so many kids were not actually being able to do the virtual learning? And the only reason why I ask that is because, so from a work standpoint, at my last job at least, they used to allow you to just take sick time or whatever, right? You got paid to be
Right.
off for the 2 weeks in order to, like for the COVID to run its course and you can come back to work or whatever. But they got to a point where they were like, actually, you're now required to take PTO to recuperate from from the virus or whatever. So I was just wondering what things are in place for students that are impacted with COVID.
Yeah. So as far as students, that's a good question. As far as students, especially when we were in the really thick of
Mm-hmm.
COVID, that attendance on paper was required. But the districts, kept going back and forth with like, we're not gonna count attendance this quarter, this semester, or whatever. But we
Mm-hmm.
were still trying to, hold kids accountable and making them attend. And
Mm-hmm.
we always know attendance is a big portion of, if you, well, we always know based off of previously. If you miss X amount of days, you got to make that up.
Right.
And if not, you fail the course or whatever. But this, in the past 15, 18 months, that wasn't necessarily the case for students. So attendance wasn't really, uh, you know, taking, it wouldn't put a kid in a situation where they would fail. Let's just put it that way. And then I remember when we first went down and that operationally, we went down in March of 2020.
Mm.
And as far as that was the third quarter, and we were getting ready to kind of spill over into that fourth quarter for that school year. And I remember there was a big deal or big conversation with the districts as far as, how the students were going to be graded and how their GPAs would, serve based off of, if they were, how to figure out if you can measure if they were impacted, how were they impacted, to what degree were they impacted, and how could we reflect that in their efforts and in their scores, um, and in their grades. And so that was really hard to figure out. And so we ended up, the districts ended up, Charlotte Mecklenburg in this case, ended up coming up with a formula, and basically, made it where when COVID took effect, that anything that happened after that couldn't negatively impact the student as far as grades. As long as they put in effort and they were showing growth, that they couldn't negatively be impacted. But as we know, people are people and kids are kids. They will figure out a way to circumvent systems.
Yeah.
And so it is what it is. And so they would figure out a way to still pass certain classes and maybe not do a lot. But I mean, we were in not only a national health crisis, but a global health crisis. And so there's a lot of things that kind of, got swept under the rug or, but at the end of the day, man, it wasn't really about the kids and in the sense of the GPA that they made or how many points they got on this test. It was more like, are they safe? Are they fed? Can we locate them? Do they have the resources? Are they psychologically safe? I mean, it was just, so much more than just worrying about a GPA. But I know that, some families really, really harp on GPAs, no matter if it's COVID or not, because it sets them up for success as they move, forward in life. Even though I'm not a big believer in SA or ACT and SAT scores being a positive correlation to how you're going to do in the world. And as far as staff, yeah, I mean, yep, it's the same way. They had to take their PTO days if they got sick and and they were out and it wasn't on their accord. I mean, it was what it was. They had to, do the quarantine and all that stuff. And so from, taking their PTO days if they ran out, FMLA, right? FMLA, I believe that's how you say it. It was the same type of structure. And so it got to the point where some staff members, I remember in our one of my schools that I worked in, because I worked in two schools during COVID, basically, the one I'm at now and the one before, where we had staff members donating PTO days to other staff members. And so some staff members, I mean, if you've been in the industry for, 15 to 20 years, I mean, you've racked up quite a bit of PTO days. And so I remember that being a big, culture booster among staff to help and support families by just lending, those days.
That's what's up.
Yeah, it was really, man. So, I think that was that question.
But so again, we only got a few minutes here left. But the one other important question that I had that I wanted to get your take on was so in your years of service, or even think back to your years of being a student, this is kind of like a two-part question. Excuse me. So the first part is, do you recall having a lot of minority teachers or professors in your years of being a student? And I want to know if you feel like the number is still low or still high as of now. And in addition to that, how important do you feel like it is to have minorities as educators in the classroom?
Dude, that's probably the best question that anyone could ask me right there. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I'll take it to the first angle on that is as a student. I mean, I remember, and it depends on where you are geographically too, but
Mhm.
I remember, being at Millbrook High School, relatively, kind of urban, suburban kind of school
Mhm.
environment. But I mean, we got different, the diversity within and when I say diversity, in this case, I'm speaking more to ethnic diversity,
Mhm.
was pretty big as far as I thought it was pretty diverse, but even the staff front was pretty diverse. But I mean, if we look at it holistically, even right now, I'll kind of fast forward that 80% of our staff in the country are white or Caucasian female.
Mhm.
And over half of our student demographics, and when you talk about diversity being racial diversity, over half and increasing that our student population in the United States as minority.
Mhm.
So if you look at that kind of um, gap there, right,
Mhm.
and it's widening that, and if we just want to put some numbers to it, there are about 5 million educators in the United States. And
Mhm.
so if we do the math and you say 80% of that, I mean that's relatively right at four, a good percentage of them being whatever, white and female. But I mean there's over 50 million students.
Mhm.
And so that gap right there, so you think how you're back to your question of how important is it to diversify
Mhm.
our staff? And again, I'm speaking more to ethnic diversity, but diversity could be young, old. We all know it could be male, female, right? But when you really talk about the experiences of, for example, I'm going to go into black educators um,
Mhm.
and minorities as well. Their experience is fundamentally different
Mhm.
than, than, and again, I'm speaking in a broad way, but than our than white educators, right?
Mhm.
It doesn't mean that they can't find common ground, but at the same
Mhm.
time that you know it's just different. I mean,
Mhm.
culturally, and so how important is it for students to be able to be taught by educators that have a different lived or shared experience than them, that they can get that I mean, it shows up, and it's always important. I always tell my teachers not to shy away from teaching tough topics
Mhm.
or controversial topics because it's not what you're teaching; it's how you're teaching it.
Right.
So we really work on with educators to putting them in a position to how they teach something to making sure it's this whole big critical race theory is a big issue, and critical race theory to us as educators means absolutely nothing. It really what it is about cultural relevant or cultural responsive teaching. We
Mhm.
look at that as if you show one side or if you teach one side, you got to teach the other side.
Right.
you know Let the students figure out. It's not that you're trying to indoctrinate them on one ideology versus another. You give them all and you
Right.
let them figure out and develop their own opinion. And so um, I think it's extremely important to, and that's one of, like I said, that's one of my big fronts right now as a doctoral student, is looking at teacher recruitment and retention of teachers of color, um,
Mhm.
and putting them in schools um, that, because a lot of the times I think our minority teachers want to teach in schools that have a lot of minority students.
Right.
But I also think that, in more of your majority or white affluent schools, I would say in this case, they need teachers of color. They need
Right.
minority teachers to so they can get that different perspective, and not only the students but the staff.
Mhm.
Get that different perspective, and I think that's just how you grow organizations at the end of the day.
Right.
We can't all be the same. We can't all have the same experiences. We have to expose. I think one of the best quotes I say is exposure leads to expansion. Exposure leads to expansion. And so if
Mhm.
we can expose them to different ideas, different races, different cultures, different whatever, then we're going to expand. And I think as a country and even as an organization, education organization, we are going to remain solid if we can still respect our differences, but also learn from each other, you know?
Mhm.
So that's kind of big. I don't know, if that answered. I can
No,
talk for days about that, dude. So
yeah, I was just about to say that, like, not only was that perfectly said, how you like came out and basically like tied everything together towards the end, but that literally hit our time just now.
yeah,
So I
absolutely,
was
man.
gonna say, you said it perfectly. I could definitely tell you're passionate about this, and this is something that I know we can talk about again, especially if it's a lot of people that tuned into this episode that like the conversation thus far and would like for us to continue this conversation. We actually know other educators that we can pull into this conversation as well. So it makes room for yet another conversation for us to have.
Yeah.
But since this does wrap up our time, I don't want to hold you up any further. I want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule. We've been trying to do this for a minute. So
We have,
thankfully,
bro.
we finally got our schedules in line in order to sit down and do this. So I appreciate you for that. And for those of you that tuned in, thank you. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. And until next time, deuces.
Yeah, man. Appreciate it, Adam.
Thank you for tuning in to Sip on This with A Paris. About to get lit with these topics. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for the love and your time. Don't forget to like, comment,